The morning sky over the eastern front was a pale, washed-out blue, thin, brittle, and cold enough that even the clouds looked frozen in place. The wind blew in long, whispering currents across thousands of miles of steppe, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery, the sharp crack of rifles, and the heavier thunder of tank engines grinding through mud and snow. It was a land defined by noise and silence, death and survival, fire and frost. Here, in the largest air war the world had ever seen, the sky itself was a battlefield. And into that sky, on a battered little airfield carved out of frost-hardened earth, a squat, almost stubby American airplane sat warming its engine. It didn't look like a fighter that belonged in a war of giants. It didn't look like something capable of changing the course of a battle, or even surviving a dogfight. It was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, a fighter many American pilots disliked, many commanders distrusted, and many German pilots openly mocked. Too slow above 15,000 feet. No turbocharger. A mid-engine design that made maintenance a nightmare. A short wingspan and small frame that looked more like a trainer aircraft than a frontline war machine. When Luftwaffe pilots first saw it, they joked that the Soviets were fighting with flying coffins, little turtles, and toy airplanes painted green. But the Soviets trained with it, mastered it. And one man, more than any other, would prove just how wrong those German pilots were. His name was Grigory Richkalov, a quiet, sharp-eyed Soviet ace with a calm face and a killer's instincts. He was not tall, he did not swagger. He did not brag about his victories or shout his achievements across a smoky officer's mess the way some pilots did. He had the look of a mechanic, the patience of a hunter, and the reflexes of a born combat pilot. And on one single mission, one that would become legend even among the famously stoic Soviet airmen, he would use that tiny, inferior, mocked P-39 to shoot down 9 German fighters in the span of a single sortie. A feat so extraordinary that even decades later, historians still dispute the total. 9 kills in one mission. Impossible, some say. But the men who saw it, those who flew with him, those who watched the sky fill with spiraling smoke and falling wreckage, they remembered it. And they remembered him. Richkalov stood beside his P-39 on that cold morning, breath curling in faint clouds around his face. The engine behind him growled as mechanics warmed it gently, each vibration pulsing through the metal skin of the aircraft like a heartbeat. The Airacobra didn't look elegant, not like the Yak-3 or the German Bf-109. It looked compact, muscular, almost clenched like a fist. And inside that fist, buried in the nose, was the weapon that made the P-39 deadly at low altitude. A 37mm cannon capable of ripping apart an enemy fighter with a single well-placed hit. Richkalov had learned to use that cannon with absolute precision. One shell, one aircraft. He rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to push warmth into his fingers. The air smelled of gasoline, cold metal, and the faint, oily smoke rising from the nearby tank depot. Snow lay in patches around the airfield, churned into grey mud where trucks and boots passed over it repeatedly. A young mechanic hurried toward him, breathless and red-cheeked. "Comrade Lieutenant, she's ready," the boy said. He couldn't have been older than 17. Richkalov nodded. "Good, how's the cannon?" "Cleaned, tested, loaded." "And the ammo belts?" "Checked twice." Richkalov allowed himself a faint smile. "Twice is good." The boy grinned nervously before running off again, swallowed by the chaos of the waking airfield. Other pilots were preparing too. Men zipped their flight suits, secured scarves, checked radios. Some smoked their first cigarette of the morning, hands trembling from cold. Others simply sat in silence, staring into the horizon where the rising sun drew a thin red line across the world. War made routines out of things that should never have become routine. Watching friends leave and never return. Flying into skies thick with smoke and metal. Living each day with the expectation that it might be the last. Richkalov took a long breath. He didn't fear death. He feared failing the men who relied on him. A runner approached with a clipboard, orders from regiment command. Richkalov took the paper, reading it with narrow eyes. Enemy activity southwest of the front. A formation of German bombers moving toward a vulnerable armored column. Fighter escorts reported. Scramble immediately. He nodded. This wasn't unusual. German bombing raids came often with the dawn. But intelligence reports were unclear. No one knew the size of the incoming formation. That uncertainty was a threat, but also an opportunity. He folded the orders and climbed into his cockpit. Inside, the P-39 felt cramped and tight, like sitting inside a steel eggshell with wings. The mid-mounted engine hummed behind his seat, vibrating through his spine. He fastened his harness, adjusted his oxygen mask, checked the fuel gauge, and tapped the glass lightly with a gloved finger. The propeller blurred into motion. The engine roared. The cockpit filled with familiar trembling heat. He switched on the radio. Static crackled in his ears. "All aircraft prepare for takeoff," the squadron leader barked. Richkalov lowered the canopy. The world outside became muffled, distant, almost dreamlike. Snow and mud mixed beneath the wheels as the P-39 lurched forward, joining the line of aircraft rolling toward the crude dirt runway. He felt calm, too calm, maybe. But calmness was not a weakness. It was clarity. The world narrowed to what mattered: sky, speed, angles, instincts. When the tower signaled, Richkalov pushed the throttle forward. The little fighter accelerated, bouncing over ruts in the ground before lifting into the biting cold air. The landscape fell away beneath him, a world of white, grey, and distant black columns of smoke where artillery struck. His squadron formed up around him, 8 aircraft climbing into formation. The radio crackled again. Enemy at 270, altitude 1,500 meters, speed unknown. Low altitude, that was good. Very good. The P-39 was a demon at low altitude, better than the Bf-109, better than the FW-190, better than most fighters in the war when fighting close to the ground. And Richkalov was the best of them. He banked slightly, adjusting course until the sun lined up behind him. A classic tactic: attack with the light in your favor. Wind roared against the canopy as the squadron sliced through the cold morning air. Minutes passed. Then Ulfurov, flying on Richkalov's right, spoke sharply. "I see them." Richkalov leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Black dots on the horizon. A swarm of them. Bombers, dozens. And fighters, many more than expected. German escorts flew in tight V-shaped formations around the bombers, engines gleaming in the low sun. Their silhouettes were unmistakable. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, fast, deadly, skilled pilots. Richkalov's hand tightened around the control stick. The Germans had brought numbers. Numbers meant confidence. Confidence meant they believed this would be easy. He could almost hear their mockery, the same words many German pilots had repeated since the P-39 first appeared on the Eastern Front. Too slow. Too small. Too clumsy. A child's fighter. They laughed when they saw its shape. They laughed when they read American reports claiming it was inferior. They laughed because the Airacobra didn't look dangerous. But when flown right, at low altitude, with a pilot who understood its strengths, it was a monster. "Comrades," Richkalov said into the radio, voice calm and cold, "we attack the fighters first, break their escort, force them down. The bombers will come later." There were murmurs of agreement. He pushed the throttle forward. The P-39 surged. Below him, the snow-covered plains blurred. Above him, the German formation tightened. Between them, the distance shrank with deadly speed. The first German pilot must have seen them approaching, because he broke formation and dove toward them. Richkalov smiled faintly. "Here they come." And the sky erupted into chaos. The two formations met in a violent collision of speed, fire, metal, and instinct. Guns flashed, shells streaked across the air, aircraft twisted and rolled in every direction as pilots fought to turn advantage into survival. Richkalov instantly picked out a Bf-109 diving toward him from above. Classic German tactic: use altitude advantage to seize initiative, strike hard, retreat up. Richkalov didn't climb to meet him. He didn't evade. He held steady. Only when the German fired did Richkalov snap the P-39 into a brutal left roll. The bullets hissed past, missing by inches. At the same instant, Richkalov yanked back on the stick, flipping behind the diving German with a maneuver the enemy pilot did not expect from such a slow aircraft. The German tried to climb. Too late. Richkalov fired. One shell from the 37mm cannon struck the German's engine. The Bf-109 erupted into smoke and flame before peeling into a fatal spiral. One. But there was no time to watch him hit the ground. More fighters dove in. 5, 10, 15. The sky filled with them. The sky above the frozen steppe had transformed into a colossal cage of spinning metal and rising smoke. Planes twisted through the early morning light like predatory birds fighting over the same small patch of sky. Trails of oil and fire streaked behind crippled aircraft, spiraling downward into the snow-covered earth below. The battle was no longer a clean formation versus formation engagement. It had devolved into a chaotic melee, the kind where instinct mattered more than doctrine and survival depended on who reacted 1 second faster than the other. Richkalov pushed the P-39 deeper into the fray, the engine roaring behind his back like an angry beast. He jerked the control stick to the right, then immediately back to the left, performing a slashing maneuver that sent him slicing between 2 German fighters. Both pilots tried to follow, but the Airacobra's instantaneous roll rate caught them off guard. It wasn't graceful, but it was brutal in a way the Bf-109 pilots never respected until it was too late. A German fighter slid into view on his right, trying to swing into position behind him. Richkalov saw the sun flash briefly off the enemy's canopy, the glint of a man who thought he had the perfect angle. The German opened fire. Tracers whipped past the P-39's left wing, glowing brightly in the frigid air. Richkalov pushed the stick forward, dropping suddenly and violently. The G-forces punched him in the stomach, pressing him against the harness so hard he felt the breath forced from his lungs. The German overshot, flying straight ahead for a brief, fatal moment. Richkalov pulled the trigger. The cannon boomed once, just once. A single 37 shell smashed into the German's fuselage, splitting it open like thin wood. The Bf-109 burst into flame, then rolled over onto its back as the pilot bilayed out, parachute whipping open hundreds of meters above the icy ground. 2. He didn't watch the man drift away beneath his silk canopy. There was no time, no room in the sky for compassion or distraction. Another German fighter dove toward him, guns blazing. Richkalov yanked the P-39 into a sharp left turn, feeling the aircraft shudder as it approached the edge of what its compact wings could tolerate. But the P-39 thrived on low-altitude power fighting, and Richkalov was a master of the knife-fight maneuver, the brutally close dogfights where speed mattered less than tight turns and lightning-fast rolls. The German pilot expected a climb. Richkalov didn't climb. He dropped, rolled, and then snapped upward with such violence that the mid-engine P-39 seemed to lurch like a living creature being whipped forward. He fired again. The cannon round tore into the German fighter's wing root. The entire wing sheared off, spiraling into the void as the rest of the aircraft cartwheeled downward, trailing smoke. 3. Static burst across his radio. Richkalov, behind you, behind. He didn't need the warning. A shadow crossed his cockpit. He threw the stick hard right, kicking the rudder with his boot. The Airacobra spun nearly sideways as a hail of bullets screamed past where he had been a fraction of a second before. A Bf-109 latched onto his tail. A skilled one. The German stuck close, pressing the attack with relentless precision. Every turn Richkalov made, the German matched. Every roll he initiated, the German stayed locked. The Bf-109 was faster and cleaner in high-speed maneuvers, and at this moment, with the P-39 losing speed from the evasive rolls, the German tightened the noose. Richkalov's breathing grew sharp and fast. His eyes darted across the sky, searching for even a single mistake in the German's pattern. There. The German pushed inside the turn, closing distance too aggressively, believing resistance was crumbling. It was a mistake of arrogance, of assuming the inferior Airacobra couldn't change the rules of the fight. Richkalov did something insane. He chopped throttle. The sudden loss of speed jolted him forward in his harness, and the P-39 almost seemed to freeze in the air. The German pilot, already committed to a high-speed turn, overshot violently, passing across Richkalov's nose in an instant. Richkalov slammed the throttle forward and fired. The cannon round struck the German aircraft square in the cockpit. The fighter disintegrated into fragments of fire and metal, scattering across the sky like dark, burning snow. 4. His radio buzzed again. Grigory, 2 more on your left, they're diving in. He looked up to see 2 Bf-109s dropping toward him like twin arrows. Instead of retreating, he angled the P-39 toward them. If he turned away, they'd chase him. If he climbed, they'd tear him apart. But a head-on attack forced them into a deadly gamble, one many German pilots hesitated to take. Richkalov didn't hesitate. He aligned nose-on, the large 37 cannon pointing directly at the incoming enemy pair. The Germans hesitated only a fraction of a second, but a fraction was enough. He fired. The cannon spat flame. One shell crashed into the first German fighter's engine block. The nose of the aircraft blew apart, debris slamming into the second fighter, causing it to split its formation and break wildly to the right. Richkalov rolled left, then upward, slotting himself above and behind the second Bf-109. The German tried to climb, bad choice. The Airacobra's mid-engine weight distribution gave it superb vertical snap at low altitude. Richkalov fired a burst. The German fighter burst into smoke and pitched downward. 5. The sky around him was thinning. He heard frantic Russian voices over the radio. Some were calls for help, others were battle cries, others stopped mid-sentence without explanation. In war, silence was often the worst sound of all. A bomber formation loomed to the north, still intending to strike the Soviet ground forces. Their escorts were now in disarray, but more German fighters were still in the area, many more. Richkalov didn't count them, he didn't need to. He reacted. A Bf-109 plunged in behind him. Richkalov pushed the stick forward, dropping down into ground-hugging altitude. The snowy fields raced past beneath him, so close he could almost feel the downdraft rippling the frozen grass. The German followed. Low-altitude combat was the Soviet specialty. It was the P-39's home territory. And it was Richkalov's kingdom. He spotted a small hill, a gentle rise no more than 20 meters tall. Perfect. He pulled up at the last second, then rolled over the crest. The German, chasing too eagerly, slammed straight into the rising terrain, becoming a plume of black smoke and scattering metal. 6. He banked sharply, spotting two Soviet Yaks fighting desperately against a trio of German fighters. The Yaks were outmatched. One was trailing smoke, the other was being pressed downward toward the treetops. Richkalov didn't think, he acted. He dove into the cluster, the P-39 howling like a struck animal as it plunged. He lined up the nearest German and fired. The cannon shell punched through the fuselage, ripping it into pieces. The pilot never had a chance to react. The second German broke right, the third climbed. Richkalov chased the one climbing. His engine roared, the P-39 accelerating with predatory focus. As he closed in, the German realized his mistake and tried to roll out of the climb, but Richkalov had momentum now. He fired. Another fighter exploded into flame, tumbling downward in a twisting column of smoke. 7. His radio crackled violently. Grigory, more Germans coming from the west, 12, 15, maybe more. He looked up. Another swarm. The Luftwaffe had committed nearly everything in the sector. Richkalov felt no fear. Only clarity. The P-39 banked sharply, wings cutting through the cold air as he maneuvered toward the new attackers. A pair of Bf-109s dove at him. He evaded the first burst of fire, then rolled between them. The tail of one fighter drifted into his sights for a split second. He fired. The shell clipped the plane's tail and sent it into a violent spin. The German pilot belayed out, chute deploying. 8. The last kill came out of instinct rather than strategy. A German pilot tried to zoom climb past him, misjudging speed and position. Richkalov spun his P-39 in a tight corkscrew maneuver, flipped behind the German by pure reflex, and let out a burst before his mind fully formed the decision. The cannon round hit the enemy fighter's wing root. The Bf-109 snapped downward in a fiery arc. 9. 9 kills in one mission. 9 kills in one sky. 9 kills by a tiny, slow, mocked fighter most German pilots refused to take seriously. But the battle wasn't over. Richkalov's ammunition was nearly gone. His fuel tank was low. His engine ran hot, dangerously hot, smoke starting to curl faintly from the exhaust stacks. Yet the German bombers still approached the battlefield. And his squadron was scattered, damaged, or gone entirely. The Soviets on the ground below had no defenses left except him. Richkalov took a breath. Then he turned the P-39 toward the incoming bombers. He was alone, but he was not finished. The sky had quieted, but only for a moment. The furious swirl of fighters had thinned, leaving behind isolated trails of smoke and burning wreckage that drifted slowly downward. The air still vibrated with the echo of engines and the fading thunder of dying aircraft. Yet now another sound began to rise, the heavy, rhythmic drone of bomber engines approaching from the west. Richkalov steadied his breath and tightened his grip on the control stick. The P-39's cockpit felt smaller now, the smell of heated oil mixing with faint smoke creeping inside from the engine running far hotter than it should. The Airacobra shuddered, not from fear but from strain. It had done things that morning no engineer had ever designed it to do. And now Rechkalov needed it to do more. He angled the nose upward and began climbing gently, not too steep. His fuel was low and the engine's temperature gauge trembled just under the red line. A hard climb might cook the motor entirely, but he couldn't stay low, not with the bombers closing in. He scanned the skies. 4, 5, 8, yes, 8 Junkers Ju-88s pushing east in a tight, disciplined formation. Black crosses on their wings, bomb racks heavy with explosives intended for Soviet armor assembling near the river. Below, columns of tanks and infantry crawled across the frozen landscape, unaware of the threat bearing down on them. And then he saw the escorts. 3 Bf-110 heavy fighters. 6 Bf-109s, worn from earlier skirmishes. Enough to keep him busy. He exhaled once slowly. He had already shot down 9 fighters. His ammunition was nearly gone. His cannon had only a few shells left, maybe 2 or 3 at most. His machine guns were half empty. But turning back was not an option. The Soviet troops below depended on him. If the bombers reached them, dozens, maybe hundreds, would die. Rechkalov pushed forward. The escort spotted him immediately. One of the Bf-109s broke formation and dove toward him, guns flashing. Rechkalov rolled, letting the tracers whistle past. The Airacobra's movements were slower now, heavier, the engine coughing as he demanded more from the aircraft than it liked. But he needed only one opening. The German overshot and tried to climb. Rechkalov slid behind him and fired a short burst, machine guns only this time. The rounds tore into the German's tail, shredding the control surfaces. The fighter twisted violently and plunged downward out of the fight. He didn't count this one, he didn't need to. The bomber formation loomed ahead. Their gunners opened fire from turret and belly guns, spraying long lines of bullets into the sky. Black puffs of flak burst around the P-39 as he darted through the incoming hail of fire. The escorting Bf-110s closed in. Rechkalov tore past the first one, too fast to shoot accurately. The second lined up behind him, cannons blinking like tiny flashes of white heat. A burst struck dangerously close to his tail, jolting the P-39 and spraying fragments of metal across his canopy. He felt the aircraft wobble but forced it steady. The Airacobra wasn't elegant now. It was wounded, battered, overworked. But it still obeyed him. He pulled into a steep climbing turn, forcing the heavier Bf-110 to overshoot. As the twin-engine German fighter passed underneath, Rechkalov dipped the nose and fired a half-second machine gun burst. The round struck one of the 110's engines, which instantly vomited smoke and flame. The aircraft veered wildly, then spiraled downward. 2 down since the turn toward the bombers. But still, he didn't count. The bombers were almost within release distance. He could see the bombs hanging beneath their bellies, long dark shapes ready to rain destruction onto the Soviet ground forces. Rechkalov pushed the P-39 forward in a shallow descent to gain speed, angling toward the lead Ju-88. The bomber gunners opened fire again, tracers stitching the air around him. Bullets slammed into the P-39's wings, punching holes that whistled as wind tore through them. One round shattered the mirror above his canopy, glass falling into his lap. Still he kept going. The first bomber filled his canopy. The engines, the glazed nose, the thin black crosses, all clear targets. He aimed at the pilot's compartment. He had only 2 cannon shells left. He fired. The cannon barked once. The shell streaked forward, glowing faintly as it spun. It struck the bomber dead center. The nose of the Ju-88 erupted in a flash. The glass cockpit disintegrated. Flames shot backward along the fuselage. The bomber sagged, wobbled, and then broke in half midair. It fell in 2 pieces. Rechkalov pulled up sharply. The G-force blurred his vision. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The P-39 groaned, the engine wheezing under the strain. 1 cannon round left. 7 Ju-88s remained. More gunfire erupted behind him. Another Bf-109. Persistent. Aggressive. Rechkalov banked right, then cut throttle. The enemy overshot, but this time Rechkalov didn't chase. He couldn't waste ammunition. He repositioned instead, diving toward the second bomber. Tracer shells from the bomber's dorsal gunner whipped past his canopy. The gunner was skilled, throwing out precise, deadly fire. One burst hit the P-39's right wing, sending vibrations through the aircraft. He steadied the fighter and drew closer. The bomber loomed large. He fired his machine guns, peppering the cockpit area. The gunner stopped shooting. Smoke began pouring from the bomber's left engine. But the aircraft was still flying, still closing in on the Soviet tanks below. Richkalov lined up once more, nose steady despite the shaking. He fired the last cannon shell. It struck the bomber's right engine cowling. The entire engine ignited, bursting into flame. The wing dipped sharply. The bomber rolled onto its side out of control, descending toward the forest in a widening spiral. The explosion against the ground shook the air. Richkalov exhaled. No cannon shells left. 6 bombers still airborne. He switched fully to machine guns and dove into the formation. The remaining Bf-109 escorts tried to intercept, but they were out of position, scattered from earlier fighting. One German pilot dove too late, firing erratically. Another turned but couldn't close the distance in time. Richkalov weaved through the formation, his guns chewing up the tail of one Ju-88 until smoke poured from the bomber's fuselage. It dropped out of formation, disappearing into clouds below. He didn't watch it crash, he was already moving toward the next target. A bomber's ventral gun opened fire from directly below. Red tracers climbed toward him, forcing him to roll inverted and dive away. The maneuver strained his screaming engine, but he rolled upright again and climbed behind a different bomber struggling to maintain formation. He fired a long, sustained burst. Rounds shredded the bomber's left wing. The aircraft lurched, dipped, and began losing altitude. German radio chatter filled his headphones, shouts, commands, fear. The formation was breaking. Richkalov pulled to the right. A pair of Ju-88s split off, fleeing west. The others turned south, trying to escape the lone demon carving them apart. He gave chase. His ammunition warning light blinked, only a handful of rounds left. He closed in on a damaged bomber. Its gunners fired weakly, sporadic bursts, no accuracy. He fired back, sweeping the cockpit with tracers until the flashes stopped. The bomber began its final descent. He pulled up and lined up again. No time to celebrate. No time to rest. No space between life and death. His machine guns clicked dry. Empty. He had nothing left to fire. No cannon. No machine gun rounds. Nothing. And 2 Ju-88s were still heading toward the Soviet ground forces. He could still stop them, but only if he did something no pilot ever wanted to do. Use the aircraft itself. He accelerated, pushing the P-39 harder than he ever had, the engine screaming in protest. Black smoke curled behind the aircraft, but he didn't back off. He lined himself up behind the closest bomber. If he matched speed and altitude exactly. If he positioned perfectly. A wing-to-wing strike or tail-to-tail tap could cripple the bomber without killing himself. Maybe. Grigory, break off, his radio screamed. You have no ammunition, break off. He didn't respond. He held steady. The bomber grew closer. Closer. Too closer. He nudged the P-39's wingtip gently toward the Ju-88's battered tail. Just a tap. Just enough. The fighters were seconds from collision. The German pilot panicked first. The bomber swerved abruptly, trying to avoid contact. Its wing clipped its partner's tail. A catastrophic mistake. Both bombers collided mid-air. A fireball erupted above the forest. 2 spiraling wrecks tumbled down in flaming arcs. The sky fell silent. Richkalov pulled away, the P-39 coughing smoke and shaking violently. His instruments flickered. The engine whined with a dying metallic groan. The aircraft wanted to stop flying. But it kept going. He looked below. The Soviet tanks remained untouched. The artillery crews kept firing. The infantry kept marching. He had stopped the bombing run alone. His voice finally crackled over the radio, faint and tired. Mission complete, returning home. There was no celebration. No cheering. Just stunned silence over the radio waves. Then finally, Grigory, how many enemy aircraft did you shoot down today? Richkalov stared at the ruined landscape, smoke drifting below. the P-39 trembling beneath him. He answered quietly, "Enough." He turned the aircraft toward home, though home was a stretch, just a muddy, frozen airstrip carved into the wilderness. He had 9 confirmed, several more probable, and 2 bombers forced into collision without firing a shot. But numbers didn't matter. Not to him. He had done what he came to do. Yet his struggle was far from over.